Hello and welcome to this special podcast series. I'm Chris Ashmore. This year, Women on Boards celebrates 20 years since the founding by Claire Braund and Ruth Med. For 2 decades, Women on Boards, or WOB, has played a pivotal role in reshaping gender balance in organisations across Australia. This podcast series looks back at the organisation's beginnings, the challenges it's faced, and the change it's helped make. In this first episode, I have the pleasure to speak with Claire about what those early years were really like and how the vision has evolved over time. Well, Claire, congratulations, 20 years with Women on Boards. I suppose to start with, a big question, how did it all start?
Well, interestingly, Women on Board started as an idea 25 years ago in 2001 by a group of businesswomen, and they were inspired by the success of female athletes at the Sydney Olympic Games and the paucity of women in management roles on sports boards. So they had an objective, which was to get women selected for board positions in Australia. It became a project of the National Foundation for Australian Women, an organisation that still exists, and also one of their key directors, Ruth Med, who in fact is the other co-founder of Women on Boards with me. And a lot of people supported the initiative. The first networking event was held in Sydney in March 2001. And bear in mind then we were just still an informal sort of network. We weren't actually anything structured. And more than 80 senior professional women gathered to meet with experienced board members. In 2002, we did our first success. We had placed 5 women on sports boards, and a number of inquiries started to come in from boards interested in putting a woman through to their boards. In 2003, a grant was obtained from the Australian government through the Office for Women, and it was for a large research project. And after that, it was also to roll out the findings of that research project across 4 capital cities, and that was Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne and Perth, and a regional area. And that's where I came in, because until that time, the driving force of Women on Boards, or the movement known as Women on Boards, had been Ruth Med, who was, of course, on the board of the National Foundation for Australian Women. But they required rural support. And I happened to be a sort of early 30s, fledgling former CEO in an industry body that was in the agricultural sector. And I met her through the Foundation for Australian Agricultural Women. I still remember we met at One Martin Place having a cup of coffee. I walked through the door and there she was. And we met way back then. And from then on, we sort of started rolling out the idea of Women on Boards. And in 2006 is when Women on Boards was officially founded. And it started as an entity in its own right with the board and with shareholders. And that really was seen as a way to take the project forward and to improve our capacity to influence the public, private, non-profit and government boards to address what was really quite a really glaring shortfall in the number of women appointed to board and decision-making roles. So, yep, that's pretty much how we did it. The rest is history because we were quite successful. I do note something funny at that point in time. At the time that the Office for Women was handing out grants, they in fact also handed out a grant for women on surfboards. And we have been quite regularly confused when you say women on boards. Is a lot of people who don't understand governance structures or are not connected with or interested in that world, the amount of times that people have said to me, oh, surfing. And I'm like, no. I grew up inland. I am as far from surfing as you can possibly imagine. And Ruth is British and doesn't like swimming at all. So there you go.
There you go. Well, I suppose in those early days, was it smooth sailing? Was it a bit difficult to get things together? How was it in those days?
I always say that we started WOB with the business plan on the back of an envelope. Had we done all of the massive amount of due diligence and planning and everything that seems to be required to get an organisation going, we probably never would have started. So Ruth and I sat down and we thought, yep, I said, we've got something here. We have the kernel of something really powerful. At that point in time, I had a young child. Ruth was going portfolio. So we were 20 years apart within our careers. And so I was in that sort of early 30s stage where I said, I've really got to start to ramp up my career now, or I have to do this properly. So we just sat down, we decided to do it and properly. We explored options like, do we become a non-profit? How do we structure? What do we do? And we decided to become an agile, innovative, small, fast-moving private company that operated very much in the model of a social enterprise. And we've always done that. And so the early days were, fast-paced, uncertain, fun, challenging, innovative. We spoke around the country getting support for women on boards. It was a fledgling membership model. One of the very early things that we did was set up a website that took all of our memberships. So we've never, ever operated any other system other than a web-based one when it comes to processing money and collecting memberships. We expanded across 2003 to 2010. And, of course, in those days, you can get down to your last $10,000. That does focus the mind somewhat. And gender balance on boards was really in its infancy. Quotas were threatening the establishment at every turn, but we had all the issues around 2009 with bringing gender in as a principle under the corporate governance principles and recommendations, which are essentially a best practice guide for organisations when it comes to governance. So, we created a few waves. In fact, we created a lot of waves. We did advocacy at AGMs where Ruth would buy 2 or 3 shares in a particular company or 100 or something like that, and then stand up at the AGM and ask the question about why there were no women on the board and get, an appallingly pathetic answer. We would be publishing letters in the newspaper. We took on the established status quo in the establishment in a way that hadn't been done before, because for so long, women who perhaps could succeed and had the opportunity or the potential or the ability to achieve those board roles had to be really careful about how they challenged that particular system. And our research had shown that, 70% of board roles were just handed out through the old largely boys network, and about 30% went through search consultants. So the lack of transparency was phenomenal. And one of the things WOB really wanted to do was to improve the accessibility of board roles. In other words, make them visible. Because if people don't know that the role is out there, then they can't apply for the role. And that was one of the big things that came through the research that we did, is that for many women, boards were not on their radar because they had no idea of where to look or where to find them or how to access those particular networks. And I think that's one of the sort of things that WOB really understood early, and we really broke the back of that.
Mm. Did you have a particular sort of KPIs that you wanted to achieve, any particular goals, and have they been achieved?
Interestingly, Women on Boards was a very early adopter of 40%. So when I say that, I will backtrack slightly. After 2009 and the success that we'd had then, that's when we had the second Women on Boards conference. And the second Women on Boards conference, we brought out somebody called Arnie Ulla, and she was the Norwegian woman in the industry department, or their equivalent of at government level, who brought in quota law. And quota law, of course, is the underrepresented gender quota. And the underrepresented gender means that you have a gender split of 40% men, 40% women, and 20% of either of those genders or other genders on their boards. And Norway had famously brought this in about 2006-07 with very little fuss. And she was responsible for implementing it. And she spoke at our 2009 conference, and she galvanised the room. We held conferences in 2008, 9, 11 and 13, and they really ramped things up when it came to putting the issue on the public agenda and starting to push those in positions of power to really, really think. Because prior to that, it had sort of been treated, I think, as sort of a nice to have, we'll just go along. So we picked up the 40%, and that meant 40%, that meant 40-40-20. So we adopted that very early on. But even prior to that, both Ruth and I had been very firmly committed that to the idea of change. We needed to ensure that the voice of women was at all of the decision-making tables. So over the years, we supported, in sort of more background ways, women accessing political power across either party, women accessing positions in community-led organisations, women accessing positions at ASX, because our real goal was to have 40% of the decision-making body being female. Now, we've achieved that across many, many board roles. Where we haven't achieved it is at the leadership table, particularly in our sort of major private sector companies, in our top ASX company, in fact, across the ASX, or in fact, in a lot of those sort of private equity style organisations also, or in that type of the market. So yes, we've been successful when it comes to boards, which is what we decided is the area that we could influence. We left the other space to others, but we thought we can actually start to have an influence on what happens at board level.
Right. Any particular reason why the success hasn't transferred to those particular companies?
Look, it has grown. The success is at board level. So when we started, 7.4% of board roles on the ASX 200 were held by females. Now it's over 40. Same. It was similar for sports organisations, university, governing bodies, government across many areas. Government in Victoria and South Australia were notable exceptions. West Australia and Queensland were woeful. And it took them quite a long time to implement any sort of target-based system. And that was the big debate that was happening in that sort of 2008 to 2013 period is, do we go for quotas, which everybody was like, no, or do we go for targets? So targets started to get a lot of traction. And I think that was something that really everybody started to understand, because business understands targets. It understands KPIs. It goes, yes, so once you've got a target, you can aim for it. You know, it's the old adage, you know, what gets measured gets managed, what gets managed gets done. And that was really where we were trying to move the whole gender diversity back to. But we were really about a professional and practical approach, which was strategies for board selection, access to those critical board and committee roles, introducing women to existing company directors. And this is sort of prior to the whole social media thing really taking off. High value networking, educational activities, mentoring. We did basic things like pull up people's CVs and say, that is not a board CV. It's not going to get you through the mix. News, communication. I mean, really, we were a change agent grounded by good research and good data.
Fantastic. I'm reluctant to ask, Claire, but did you face much pushback?
Oh, yes, we faced lots of pushback. I mean, the interesting thing that happened with WOB also, and that I haven't mentioned, is that our idea became so popular that we exported it. So in 2010, I received a Churchill Fellowship, and it was to look at the issue around gender on boards in Norway, the UK and France. So I went there in 2011. I interviewed 63 leaders. And out of that, I recall I met the then co-founder of Women on Boards in the UK, Fiona Hathorn, and I met her at an event in London. And she said, would this work here? And I said, well, it's the same system, Commonwealth-based, parliamentary. There's no reason that it shouldn't, because at that point in time, the UK was having its own debate. And so I do recall calling Ruth and saying, how are you? And she said, I'm well. I said, I have a question. I said, are you up for international expansion? And she famously said, yes, but I'll only go over there once a year. And so I was like, okay. So we established Women on Boards in the UK off the back of Women on Boards in Australia. And I think that was something that was really, really, I think that cemented us. And it was at that point onwards that it became easier to prosecute the whole idea, because some of the early significant challenges that we faced were around some of the basic things that strike all female founders: access to finance, access to good networks. It did help that Ruth was in her post-exec and in her portfolio career, so she was on boards. I was younger and in my own business. People assuming that we wouldn't survive, that we were just another good idea that was going to wilt on the vine. But in getting over that, the strategies that had most impact were, You've just got to believe that what you're doing is right. And Women on Boards was an idea whose time had come. Women on Boards was the right thing to do. And so we had absolute belief. We had tenacity. We had persistence. As I said before, you get down to that last 10K in the bank, really focuses your mind. We had a bias towards action. We were fearless in many ways because we had nothing to lose. We were not the people seeking many of those board roles, and so we were not frightened of biting the hand that was potentially going to feed us. So we could draw a line in the sand and we could not step back from that line. And that's what we did. We formed a formidable partnership. I said at Ruth's farewell when she left the company in 2023 that the secrets of our success have been complete and absolute trust. You've got to have faith in your business partner. You've got to have each other's back and the back of those people who are within your organisation. So you have to trust and you have to believe in them and you have to back them. You've got to have an unwavering commitment to a shared vision and a shared purpose, which we did, and you've got to be able to bring everybody else along with you. And that's something that WOB's been really successful in. So we have a whole group of Women on Boards members who've just picked up the idea and made it their own. And many of them have started organisations, committees, projects, that are committed to the same ideals that WOB is, and that's been brilliant. I also think that, some of the challenges that we overcame as well, regarded as having really quite a good sense of humour, a fine sense of the ridiculous, and not letting lack of access to capital stand in the way of getting something done. There is always a way to do something. And so I think that while we had those challenges, we were quite fearless in how we faced them. And we never let anybody say to us, well, you can't do something. We always found a way around that. And I think that was powerful. And it was also quite hard to say no to WOB in many ways because it's like, oh, so you don't support gender diversity or gender balance, which is what I prefer to call it actually, gender balance. And many people, of course, didn't want to say that. So I've been looking back over the archives, over all the things that we've done, all the letters we've written. I found one to Anthony Albanese at one point in time when he was then the Minister for Infrastructure, berating him about the lack of boards in his department and of course the federal government has since changed. But it's interesting when you look back over the time and see the role that advocacy played and in all that we did too. So, yeah. Sorry, I went off track there.
Not at all. Well, just on that, since the beginning, when the Women on Boards started, how has the vision changed over the last 20 years?
It's interesting. We started very much with a focus on boards. We started with a focus on making boards accessible. We started with opening up the boardroom to women, both with the skills and experience, who wanted to achieve those things. And Arnie Orla said it to me, or she said it at the Women on Boards conference in 2009, and I often use this. She said, what quota law did in Norway is it turned off the spotlight and it turned on the floodlight. And what that did is it meant that previously, when your spotlight was on and you were the person, the chair of the board, the nominations committee chair, the recruitment consultants, you could see everybody in your network and in your field of view. That was a fairly narrow band of light. But what quota law did, by saying you must go out and you must look and you must have some more women on your boards, suddenly everyone turned on the spotlight. And all of a sudden, at the edge of that light were hundreds of people who could lay equal claim to mini board roles that nobody had seen. And more important, because they couldn't be seen, they couldn't get into this narrow circle. So I think one of the things that WOB was so successful in doing early on was putting women on the radar of those who had the gift of putting women on boards through many of those various processes. We also forced some transparency, to say, why not advertise vacancies? Why not put them up there? And so many people said to us, you just never know who might apply. And then in the next breath, they would be saying, well, when we advertise roles for, senior managers or something else, women don't apply. And I said, well, you can't have it both ways. So if you put the vacancy up, people will be able to self-select. So build the stadium, people will come. Over time, that evolved because we understood that we had to have a pipeline as well. Now, there was a lot of women who there was this idea that suddenly women had to be trained for board roles. Women don't have to be trained. They're not circus animals. What women had to be do was asked. And so one of the things that we did is to get women into those roles where they're more visible, and particularly in that leadership space. So we created a program called The Next Generation of Female Leaders in 2010. And it ran until COVID, actually. So it ran for 10 years. And it was really successful in giving women access through this particular project that we ran, where they had to go out and interview 6 successful chairs and CEOs and then write a very large report on it. And it was like a leadership in action. And so many of them got access to people that they previously wouldn't by using the Women on Board's name, using the project, and then leveraging that. And many of them learnt much and stayed in touch. So we've always been part of that leadership space. That program has since evolved into something that we call personal career management, which is understanding how you might move yourself through to those senior and board roles. Of course, we exported to the UK in 2012, which I have mentioned. It became its own organisation and has subsequently, we then sort of restructured the organisation, or restructured the whole group, because it was largely owned out of Australia, and we restructured the group, and it has subsequently been bought by another party over there now. 2018 and 19 is when we really started to think about the fact that we were successful in having 40%. So many boards had achieved 40%. So what did so we had gender balance, but there's diversity within gender. And so we did a piece of research, well, that was in about 2021, which showed us that there was a real paucity of women of culturally diverse background on boards. So we set up the First Nations and Cultural Diversity Committee to shine a light on that, and to try and not just encourage, but to do what we did when we set up Women on Boards, which was to start to get people to think more strategically about the composition of their board and its diversity within a gender, because Australia has a very large migrant and culturally diverse population. I mean, 51 or 52% of our population were either migrated here or are first generation. So we're missing all that talent. We're missing all those people on our boards, because the percentage on boards is about 12%, male or female. So there's a real lack of consideration of other perspectives and other diversities. Age is the other one. Most board members tend to be, particularly in the ASX, sort of over 65. I think the average age is about 64. So what are we missing, and how are we not capturing that, particularly in this, volatile, uncertain global world where many of our boards are have a very strong external focus. Many customer bases are, not just Anglo. So we have put a real focus on cultural diversity since 2019, 2020, and on the diversities within gender. Now, we still focus primarily on women because that's what WOB does. I'm very happy for other people to focus on men, but WOB does women. And then post-COVID, what we found is many of our women were very successful. I mean, we've had women who are members of Women on Boards for, 18, 20 years, and many of them have achieved really significant board roles. They've had major influence. And that's really where we've tried to move to now, is to set up programs and events and structures that support women who are successful on boards to be their best self while they are there, to have the influence and that we would love them to be able to have. So getting on board was never enough for WOB. We wanted everybody to be really successful and impactful while they were there. So to that end, we've set up things. We've had the WOBSX program running since 2018. We've had the WOBNED circles running. We've had number of programs that run that try to really support women to be the best that they can be. So that's sort of a little bit of how our program, how our organisation and what we've done has evolved over time.
That's fantastic. And I suppose from when you started 20 years ago, the amount of CEO or board member mentors out there now is really even amplifying the success that you're having.
I think I'd almost consider it the greatest success of WOB has been in the creation of a league of extraordinary women. And not just a league of extraordinary women, but a league of women who put a hand up for help and they reach a hand down to pull others up. And so WOB has become a real circle of reciprocity. You are the woman you were, the woman you are, and the woman whom you will become across your life cycle within WOB. And that's been super powerful because it's created a cheer-led group where women support women really, really strongly. I mean, there are women who say, this role's not for me, I'm not exactly for it, I know somebody's hunting for it, why don't you have a go? So that idea that it's collaborative, it's not competitive, that's been really strongly fostered. And so I think one of the greatest things that's happened through WOB is the community that it has created. And that is just an absolute testament, really, to the many fine people that we have as part of a WOB. And many of them, of course, are now in that cycle where they are mentoring others. So there's been that lovely informal mentoring, coaching type of process happening. Women have, had coffees endlessly with other women. They've set up businesses. They've gone off and sat on boards together. They've created new projects. They've done all sorts of things. So we've had that really lovely collaborative approach. They've mentored each other. We've had both formal and informal mentoring processes. We have something called the WOB community, which is a app-based platform now, and people can set up those relationships. So, yeah, there's been a lot of mentoring. Mentoring's not a top-down thing, and I think in the early days there was this idea that you'd get this lovely male sort of chair mentor and they would guide you through it and show you how to be exactly like them. And that's not how it works. I mean, most women know that, careers, life cycles, they go all over the place. Life is messy. Life is difficult. And for many of them, they're really hitting their straps within their professional career post-45. Which is the other thing that I'm really now concerned about is the ageism that's really creeping into particularly our workplaces. I know so many women who are done with a lot of the caring responsibilities that happen up to 45, and they are just fully going for their careers. The amount of women in their 60s and their 70s at WOB who are serving on boards, consulting, looking after their aging parents, doing a suite and a portfolio of activities is extraordinary. And so I think capturing that richness, that diversity is something that, WOB's really going to focus on.
Well, looking back on your 20 years with Women on Boards, Claire, what would you say has been, the most enjoyable for you?
I think the most enjoyable was having a fantastic business partner. Ruth really is an extraordinary person. She enabled me in a way and was that I hadn't been enabled before. She was a great mentor to me. And she's so quirky. So together, the two of us just had this wonderful, fun, connected relationship. We would travel around Australia together and sit on aeroplanes and dream up new projects and new programs and new events and people that we were going to go off and, hit up to say, right, we need a room for this and a space for that. Let's just do this. So we just kind of got it done. And so I think that was the greatest thing for me about WOB is being in a business partnership where it was absolute trust and we knew the other person had your back and we had a lot of fun, and you'd ring them up and you'd have a twinkle in your eye and you'd say, right, let's get this done. So I think that sense of shared purpose was something that was really, really fabulous. WOB has morphed since then. Since Ruth left, we have now a very independent, and the other thing that I think was that WOB really did well is we iterated our own governance. So 2016, we brought on 2 independent non-executive directors. That was really powerful because you have to be accountable. And when you own the company, you've got to be accountable to others. So I think the idea of independence at that board level is really, really critical. As we speak, we have a superb chair in Sheena Wilson. Recruiting her, I think, is another great success story. She's also has, for many years for me, been an amazing mentor and a very dear friend. But she's really become an extraordinary chair for WOB. We have very good people in WOB. We have loyalty in our staff. We have extraordinary staff. We've had many long-serving and amazing staff who I'd like to give a really big shout-out to. So that's been a very powerful part of our success. I think we've changed the face of how people think about women serving in board roles, and I think we've done that just through hanging it in there. You know, we've been an integral part of that story. All the WOB members who've stuck with us over so many years, they've been part of that story. And together, I think we've been able to force some really, or not just force, but achieve some really lasting and meaningful change. And that's been very, very powerful for us. So, yeah, so lots of successes. There's been lots of small ones, but when you look at it just on the grand scale, I think it's the longevity, the loyalty, and the great sense of commitment and purpose and shared purpose that everybody from the board through the staff through to the members has, and that really makes for something special within an organisation. I actually say on introducing WOB that when you come to WOB, for many women, they find their tribe, and it creates a bit of work to create a tribe. But yeah, we found a great tribe here at WOB.
If you were to go back 20 years in what you know now, would you have done things differently?
Look, I think you always want to do things slightly differently, but the reality is you can't. It's always an interesting question, isn't it? Because, of course, we can't go back. We don't have time machines. So how would have we done it differently? Would have we sat down and done exhaustive business plans and gone out and found backing? No, I don't think that I would have liked to have done that. Sure, it might have been easier. Sure, it might have been financially more lucrative. But would it have been as impactful? Would it have been as fun? Would it have kept me sustained mentally for 20 years? Probably not. So I think the only advice that I would have given is that my children grew up through Women on Boards. So I spent a lot of time away from them. And I think if I could, I would have tried to change that somehow. I'm not sure how, but it's the thing that I think that you miss a bit. Is that you look at them now and they're much older, and you look back and you think, oh, my gosh, they grew up so fast. So, you know, don't miss the wood for the trees kind of thing. And I think that's the only thing that I would change. As I said, we've been incredibly fortunate in the staff that we've had at WOB particularly. So I think we hired well. We hired on loyalty as much as anything, and I think that was particularly powerful for us too. So, yeah, not much to change.
Well, I suppose final question, Claire. What's the future for WOB?
What's in the future? Well, until all these terrible things have happened in the Middle East and things, we all probably thought we perhaps had a little bit of an idea about what our future was. It's a bit like COVID times. I think where we're heading with Women on Boards is we're really cementing our place in the marketplace for really some really quality programs that have impact. They really do achieve board role. They really do create lasting impact for the women who do those programs. Somebody said to me at a networking the other day, they said, Women on Boards has changed my life. People write to me about that. And I think it's because above all, we believed in them. We believed in them, we backed them, we had confidence, we had trust, we had faith. And so we will continue to do all of that. We will continue to adapt what we do to the marketplace. We will continue to try and bring people really, really high quality offerings. We'll continue to support people. We'll continue on our track of quality governance. And we'll continue with advocacy, because there are some areas, there's some pockets of resistance, particularly around the transparency. One of the areas that particularly concerns me is the Commonwealth Government and their board roles. There's a real lack of transparency. There's a real lack of access and ability to access those roles. There was a terrific report written in 2023 by Commissioner Briggs or former Commissioner Briggs. And it is really a wonderful blueprint for how you could set up a really good, transparent, accountable process for boards and committees. And so I think particularly our government boards at state and federal level really need to be committed to that, because they need to be role models for what the private sector looks like. I think the other thing that is going to happen is that directorship is changing. It is changing really fast. Board roles are hard. There's a lot more work. I think the other change that is going to happen is that charity and big end of town not-for-profit sector, particularly around social care, particularly in those sectors where there's a lot more services being outsourced to them from the state and federal governments. There's a lot more pressure on them. I think there's going to be pressure to start to compensate their board members, because unless you start to do that, the amount of time and effort that is required to put into those roles, people aren't going to be doing it. It's a very regulatory space, particularly around things like aged care, social care, as it should be. But with that comes attendant responsibilities that not everybody really understands. So I think we're in a period of change and shift when it comes to board roles. I'd love to see a continued focus on cultural diversity on boards. I'd love to see, a really high percentage of our boards embracing and understanding the richness that people of First Nations and culturally diverse background bring to our boards and can bring to our organisations. So I think there's a number of areas there that women on boards can still very much be and part of and play an influential role in.
Well said. Well, Claire, once again, congratulations on 20 years with Women on Boards, everybody at the organisation, everyone who's been involved. So thank you and best of luck.
Thanks, Chris.